Hey everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Working Dad Weekly. Per popular demand, I'm going to be talking about the historical context of American urban planning. Put this to a poll a couple months ago. Just kind of been busy with work and baby and everything, so I haven't gotten around to it till now. But today we're going to be talking about the development of current urban planning. This is important because every aspect of your life in America is going to be impacted by the environment you live in, whether that's suburbs or the urban area or rural. All of it is planned, documented, and controlled by your local, state, and federal government. The development of this, you can trace it all the way back to Mesopotamia or in Iraq with the first cities, but we're not going to go that far. For the purposes of the discussion today, we're going to focus post-Civil War America and Europe. This is important because they're intertwined and interlinked. As you move and you develop in America after the Civil War, with the advancements of technology, the ability to move rapidly across the Atlantic Ocean, and the instances of two world wars in Europe, there was a very much an intertwining of thought processes between American planners and European planners. And this interplay is really what built and developed our modern system of planning. So, looking at a 35,000 foot bird's eye view, what you have is in the post-Civil War America, all of the cities, towns, think about out west or, on the East Coast, they were built around the fastest and greatest technology of the day to transport people and material, which was the rail lines or boats. So that is why you had a lot of port cities, and then internal, you had a lot of cities that were built along rail lines. They were built at junction points where you would have rail yards, where you would have maintenance workers, where you would have dock hands or shipyard hands, and their job was to upload or download materials onto the trains for the local community or for selling at market, further down the line. What this did was it created pockets of population growth that became a little bit more sprawled. And then the transport between those cities was still mostly by either foot traffic or through horse and carriage. So the cities were linked outside the rail lines through horse and carriage, horse and buggy, foot traffic, and then with the rail line, you had the ability to move people rapidly from one space to another. Then you move into the 1900s, where we have World War I, which completely devastated Europe, but America was pretty much unscathed. And that's where we'll start getting into chapter 1, which is where we take the first look away from the historical planning of the 1800s, which was basically the same in Europe as it was in America, and you start to see vast differences that develop in the aftermath and recovery of World War I. Hello everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Working Dad Weekly. My name's Nate Stowers. You may know me as Dad from the channel Working Dad Notebook. Today we're going to be talking about some of the historical context of American urban planning. This was the winner in the poll we took a few weeks ago for first episode content you guys wanted to hear. So today we're going to be talking about two planning theories, the modernist planning theory as well as urban renewal planning theory. These two planning theories cover basically post-Civil War America and then all the way up until about the 1980s. Which really gets us into modern theory of today. My background in this is I'm a PhD candidate at Liberty University for public administration. I have a master's degree in disaster emergency management and homeland security and a bachelor's. Hey, good morning everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Working Dad Weekly. My name's Nate Stowers. You may know me as Dad from Working Dad Notebook YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about the historical context of American urban planning, really looking at post-Civil War America up until modern day. We're going to be viewing this from two planning theories, the modernist planning theory as well as the urban renewal planning theory. We'll touch on a few others that are interplayed throughout that timeline, but those are going to be the bulk of our content for today. My background is I'm a PhD candidate at Liberty University for public administration. I have a master's degree in disaster emergency management and homeland security from American Military University and a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of North Georgia. This kind of system and process for how we plan is kind of important for everyday life in America because it shows you the step-by-step analysis of how we went from being centered around rail lines to our kind of commuter culture that we have now in the suburbs, and really everything that goes in between for how we ended up with urban decay, gentrification, or many different instances of high social value. So looking forward to getting into today and exploring this episode. I hope you guys enjoy it. But with that, we'll get into our introduction. Introduction. So for what we're talking about is today, with the historical context of American urban planning, we must first look at what is urban planning. Well, urban planning is nothing more than a system used to organize the placement and type of infrastructure that will create a local ecosystem. A lot of words to say. It is the thought process for how you will intelligently design the area in which you're going to live. Now, there is a lot of interplay in thought processes between America and Europe as we look post-Civil War and all the way up till post-World War II modern day. So with this, we're going to look at why we moved from being focused on the transportation mechanisms at the time for the mass transit of both people and material for military and economic purposes. In the 1800s, this was the rail lines as well as shipping through ports of entry either across the Atlantic or internally in major river systems such as the Mississippi River. Within those, you find that in the 1800s, it was the first time where humans could move away from our traditional model of living near water sources. So if you look all the way back to Mesopotamia and Iraq, all urban centers were based off of water. So people had to live close enough to support what we call BLS, basic life support services. That's why all cities were built around water systems as well as an ability to produce food. So once we moved from hunter-gathering societies into agricultural societies and raising farm animals and growing our own food, it became very important to have arable land as well as water sources in order to build an urban center. With the invention of the railroad, we were able to move beyond just freshwater, rivers, lakes, streams, ponds, and move into the interior of our nation in America. That's why if you look at the American West, a lot of small cities and towns that still exist along Highway 66 or Route 66, these were built along railroads because that enabled you to move the material, food, water, fuel, everything you may need, as well as people, to those more remote locations that were otherwise connected through cart and buggy or foot traffic. Pretty interesting, that design mechanism held all the way until post-Civil War and early 1900s when you see the invention of the automobile, which moves us into the necessity of creating a design mechanism for these cities to put them in a more intelligent kind of layout that could facilitate the traffic of vehicles and automobiles as well as railroads and still link us to our ports for our transatlantic shipping that we had. So that moves us into our chapter 1, which is going to be talking about modernist planning, which covers the years about 1920 through 1949. Throughout my time in the U.S. military, I have pretty extensively traveled the globe. Currently, I've deployed and through work, I've moved in over 30 different nations, and I've seen a lot of different ways that cultures have developed, fostered, and maintained ancient cities. So, you look in the Middle East, for example, in nations such as Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, which would appear to a Westerner to be mass chaos, in their layout and design of roads and buildings. has a practical purpose as delaying the advancement of enemy armored vehicles or allowing for multiple choke points to conduct anti-armor ambushes. The designs were chosen out of necessity, not practicality. So what you see is in a typical layout of an American city or a European city, you've got more checkered board, designed with, First Street, Second Street, Third Street, Main Street, side streets, as they lay themselves out, because this increases the ease of travel of the automobile. But what you have in a lot of ancient cities is they were designed for defense purposes. So they're circular, they've got dead ends, they've got narrowing streets, because they gave the people who were residing in the city a strategic advantage or a tactical advantage when an advanced nation or advanced army would attempt to lay siege on them, because it gave them the ability to establish defendable positions throughout the entire ecosystem of the city. However, with the advancements of artillery or mass transmit of troops with armored personnel carriers like we have today, the invention of the tank, if you go all the way back to black powder, moving into rifled cannons, rifled artillery, rifled small arms, it really made this kind of design and layout of cities obsolete, because you no longer needed to seize a city completely with advanced waves of infantry. Now you could seize a city through barrages. You could use, today we use strategic attacks through guided missiles, through guided artillery, and you can make those pinpoint surgical strikes that no longer require you to have to advance people down winding roads and go house by house in order to take a city. You can now do it through intelligence gathering and things of that nature. So that means that we start moving into why, I'm just going to cut this whole section out. So in chapter 1, we've got the modernist planning. This is interesting because during this time period, you're talking roughly 1920 through 1949, post-World War I. This is when Europe was completely decimated. They were leveled, almost the entire continent had to be rebuilt, and planners at the time had to really think about how they were going to do so in a manner that enabled them to increase their socioeconomic standing with a depleted population. So what you had was a shift away from cities that were built as fortresses towards cities that were built with the intention of having high economic return on investment. So throughout my travels across the world, the United States military, I've been to many countries, about 30 at this point. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, in nations like Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, and in those, which you'll find a lot of ancient cities, are built in circular patterns with narrow roads. The reason for this is that they were easily defendable. They gave you many points in which you could ambush someone who was attempting to lay siege on your city, and they were very good for siege warfare. Modern technology, the invention of black powder, advancements in artillery, rifled small arms. Now we have guided missiles, we have guided artillery. We can do surgical strikes that makes this form of planning no longer the best way to defend your area. Because of that, there's less of a military focus on the design of our cities and more of an economic focus. That brings us into post-World War I Europe, where national leaders were faced, they had to rebuild the entire continent, just about, and they wanted to do so in a way that rejected historical influences of that siege warfare in an attempt to modernize urban environments and incorporate natural aspects while accounting for emerging technologies such as automobiles and electronic tramways. When you look at this, there were very deliberate efforts that were taken on the function of architecture over the art of its form. So that's when you start looking at cities that were using new building materials, new technologies and concepts to increase accessibility and efficiency. With this increase of accessibility and efficiency, you had pretty significant impacts on the entire planning process. Really, as automobiles became more prevalent and reliable, there was a shift in city design that paved the way for our current commuter culture. This revolutionary culture shift was one of the central hubs surrounding a rail station to the system of satellites billowing out from urban economic centers and allowing for an expansion in size, scope, and shape of metropolitan footprints. That's a lot of words to essentially say that we shifted from being localized on a rail line, on a rail hub, to being able to sprawl out further and further because of the invention of the automobile. So what you start having here is you start having an expansion of the cities where the economic centers of the cities were located along the rail lines. So you still had your manufacturing, you still had your production of food, equipment, storage, sorting, and things of that nature. But you started intermingling in there with cheap housing, with more expensive housing starting to move into the rural area where you had plantations, you had large centers of growth that could be built and linked to those economic production and industry inside the city with residential areas outside the city. And this really led to some issues. So one of the big issues that you had was there was a significant increase in crime, sickness, poverty, and really economic decline in the areas that began to be referred to as slums, ghettos, things of that nature. These failures were really failures of imagination. So essentially, the largest problem with the modernist urban development theory is that there was so much focus placed on increasing the efficiency and of economic production that there was not an emphasis placed on community or social interest or anything of that nature. So what you had was you had a lot of high efficiency buildings made inside the cities for producing industrial materials to bring economic opportunity and job growth, that there was not a thought of how do we incorporate housing, how do we incorporate services, how do we incorporate sanitation. These things were all just overlooked in the aftermath of World War I. Luckily for Europeans, this model was very short-lived because shortly after World War I, as we all know, there was World War II. World War II went through and again decimated the European continent. Yeah, so World War II decimated the European continent and kind of gave a natural reset for a lot of the issues that you had under the modernist planning theory. So really, you got to say, well, how did these problems, kind of rise or anything like that? And really, the major problems with the modernist planning theory was its disregard for environmental impact changes in the urban footprint that they could produce. Such as a loss of biodiversity in cities, destruction of ecosystems, proliferations of cars, urban heat islands, environmental pollution, depletion of water resources, and really what we would now today we would say a lot of it was just purely pollution, right? You had a lot of coal was your main heat source at the time, main energy production source, and it just was putting soot everywhere, getting on clothes, getting on cars, getting on different things. You had instances in Europe where you had moths that you can see they began to evolve to become a darker gray because it became easier for them to blend in with the environment if they were the color of soot compared to what their natural color of white was, because they began to stand out and birds would just eat them faster. So you look at these issues and they show you've got a failure of calculating risk or balancing the benefit of increased economic growth with quality of life of residents. The ultimate impact of this problem was the creation of economic dead zones, referred to as slums, and these really created a dangerous and decaying environment in metropolitan areas, and eventually led to a drastic shift in thinking about urban planning post-World War II. Which moves us into chapter 2, which is World War II. So in chapter 2, we get into urban renewal. So urban renewal is the thought process for changing cities away from these decaying environments that you had under the modernist planning and attempting to fix infrastructure and fix problems that you found in slums and quality of life and disease. So urban renewal takes place from about 1949 to 1974, and it's it has a similar origin story to the modernist urban development thinking that kind of led from the brainstorming of government officials that were faced with reconstructing most of the world at this point in the aftermath of World War II. In facing this reality, public officials and local government officials were using the process known as eminent domain, which is where the government will come in and forcibly purchase your land so that they can establish better control mechanisms in updating damaged and aging infrastructure. Typically, this can be seen with the purchasing of industrial and residential areas that have fallen into disrepair due to either the global conflict or just the cruel march of time. In America, the process really was spearheaded by the Housing Act of 1949 and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, that was created. Over the life cycle of the act, the federal government spent approximately $13 billion across 1,200 cities in the United States. Globally, the system of thought also greatly impacted Europe through the Marshall Plan, which was the American subsidization of the reconstruction of Europe in the aftermath of World War II. The plan was seen as an opportunity in the destruction of large urban areas in the unfortunate decrease in population associated with the long bloody conflict as a new birth or a new emergence in order to incorporate technological and social changes. There was also literal issues that popped up with urban renewal in that it really did not take into consideration underlying human issues that led to the decay of cities in the first place, and really all right, stop there. So this led us into urban renewal. Some of the issues that you had with urban renewal, though, was that, again, there was not so much a focus on the underlying human issues that you found with the creation of slums or economic dead zones, and instead there was a look at incorporating new technologies to move forward the planning and development of cities for the reconstruction in the aftermath of World War II in order to make them more social and economically vibrant. Here you had market garden cities, you had the idea of bringing back beauty and bringing functionality in. So through the use of eminent domain, what you had was America subsidizing the European redevelopment through the Marshall Plan, where politicians went through, they took large areas that had previously been slums or residential areas inside of city centers, and they started developing them into manufacturing and shopping and service-based centers. They moved low-income housing to the outskirts of the cities, what we would now today call the suburbs. The reason why this could be facilitated was the proliferation of the automobile. This enabled, both in Europe and America, people to commute into work. Now, in Europe, there was a focus on public transportation from the outskirts of the cities, which is why you still don't see as much of a commuting culture inside of Europe as you do in America. Now, the reason why they were able to focus on public transportation systems was because of the depopulation that they experienced from World War II, as well as the total destruction of many urban environments. This meant that when they were rebuilding, they had the ability to rebuild entire cities for a smaller population. In America, there was some social backlash to the Marshall Plan in the idea that we were, as a nation, spending very large sums of money to rebuild Europe while our own infrastructure was falling into decay. So, through the creation of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, what you found was they spent $13 billion across 1,200 cities, and what they focused on at the time was moving residential areas to the outskirts and the creation of suburbs in order to turn cities into a more efficient economic driver for the area. The idea behind this was people would live in cheap land on the outskirts of town, commute into work, and then have economic driving forces all co-located so that it would increase efficiency of interplay between organizations and businesses. The reason why there wasn't as much of a focus on public transportation in America as there was in Europe was, simply put, we didn't have destroyed cities. Our cities were still standing, so instead of us completely remodeling or redesigning the cities, we did targeted remodeling in order to cut cost. And one of the largest ways to do this was to push everyone to the outskirts. So that's why you start seeing in really the 1960s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you start seeing the push towards the American dream, the house with the white picket fence, 2 kids, the car, all of those kind of propaganda and different things that were pushed, because what the government was attempting to do was to move people to the suburbs in order to increase the efficiency inside the cities. What this allowed was a centralization of services for basic life support, such as power, water, sewer, along these new suburbs and housing developments. So you were able to consolidate services of support in order to save cost for the government as they were doing this redesign. Then what you see as a attempt is you also see an attempt to remove the blight of slums or ghettos from inside the city and move them to the outside of the city. This comes with part of the renewal aspect of beautifying the cities, of making them a little bit more aesthetically pleasing and things of that nature. But there was a lot of failures, because one of the biggest weaknesses of urban renewal is that there was a failure to fix the human aspects of poverty. There was not a focus on education. There was not a focus on health. There was not a focus on fixing underlying social problems. There was just a focus on making the cities more efficient and making them more conducive to economic activity. And what you have is in major cities such as Chicago, Detroit, New York, Atlanta, Los Angeles, there was a movement of low-income families from their traditional homes into the suburbs without an alleviation of their generational wealth issues. So what you had was there was an increased cost burden put on these families, because as they moved from their traditional family homes inside the cities to the suburbs, there was an initial decrease in cost of living from being outside the city, but there was also the incurrence of costs of now they had to purchase an automobile, now they had to commute, now taxes started being raised because the value of the land started to increase due to competition in and around the city, and now competition to purchase land in the suburbs. So what you found is that people that were on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale kind of got left behind. And that leads us into the idea of gentrification, of going into an area and purchasing, old, decrepit, or cheap housing and turning it into a shopping center. And now there's less availability of cheap housing, while also simultaneously there's an increase in the value of land, causing taxes and service costs to increase, leaving a vast portion of the American population behind, which also causes a cultural shift from single income families into dual income families, because now in order to support a family, you can no longer do it just off of one breadwinner. That moves us into the creation of en masse childcare services, of schools, of different things of that nature that needed to be created, because now instead of having one family member at home and living off of the income of one parent, you now had both parents entering the workforce with children, no one being left behind to watch children. This also led to people having to work longer. That's why retirement age started creeping upwards. Yes, because of the decrease in crime, you had a decrease in health, pandemic-related issues and endemic-related issues. The life expectancy of the average American drastically increased, about 30 years over this time period. But what you also had was people had to work longer to support themselves. So again, in order to keep up with childcare, in order to keep up with the new cost of having to have automobiles, of having to move and transport, you started seeing two-income families and less time spent inside the home raising children and more time spent in the workplace in order to afford the increased cost of living due to urban renewal. What you also found within this is that as you have urban renewal continues, you now have found really a dichotomy, or not a dichotomy, but you have a split in between middle, high income and low income. So low income essentially gets centralized into pockets, and then surrounding those pockets of low income, you now have middle income, high income families that have the ability to move further and further away from your low income sections, leading to areas of political importance where the entirety of now a district that's represented, in Congress is now all low income. Whereas before it would have been split evenly amongst low, middle, and high income. Now you have sections that are all high income earners, all middle income earners, and all low income earners, which has led to economic warfare that goes through the 80s, 90s, and into today, which is where we see a lot of our politics as a lot of it as the ins and outs, the has versus the have-nots. And this, in large part, was due to urban renewal planning theory that then moved people and consolidated them into socioeconomic bubbles. It's not everything, but it's just very interesting to see how from a 35,000 foot bird's eye view, how moving population centers to the outskirts of town also created pockets of socioeconomic residential areas, which has then led to representation in government of certain socioeconomic groups because that make up the bulk of your electorate. It's the first try at this. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, let me know, guys. Really, I was trying to just do a very quick overview of about 200 years of history. Obviously, if there's something you guys would like me to go into greater detail with and actually get into the nuts and bolts of how it happens or what's going on here, hey, please just let me know. If we continue doing these, I'm going to try to get a lot better at them. But for a first crack at it, I feel like this was a pretty complicated set of circumstances that moves forward. Again, about 200 years of history, crossing 2 continents. But either way, let me know in the comments what you guys think, and we'll try to keep them shorter, cleaner in the future, and maybe we can make this a weekly thing. But either way, it's Nate Stowers with Working Dad Weekly, and hopefully see you guys soon. Bye-bye.